One of America's most revered magazines, The New Republic, is out with its May 2022 democracy issue. The reporting, the findings are simply stark and startling. 67% of Democrats, according to a poll, believe that democracy is under threat. 80% of Republicans believe that democracy is under threat. Here to talk about all of this is Michael Tomasky. He is the editor of The New Republic. Michael, thanks for joining us. What's driving these numbers?
Polarization, pessimism, darkness, cynicism, and most of all, David, two really different conceptions between Democrats and Republicans, between liberals and conservatives, about what democracy is and what this country should be.
And you go into that in a number of articles and essays. It's a clear distinction also about the role of government, correct?
Very clear distinction about the role of government, Democrats and liberals, of course. I mean, these findings in the poll, we commissioned a poll that is one part of the issue. The issue consists of many, many different articles. Every article in the issue of the magazine has something to do with the crisis democracy confronts. But the poll was one part of that. And the poll findings aren't shocking, but they're illuminating and depressing, and they tell you something about just how differently we see things, like the role of government, like the definition of freedom, like the particular things that are plaguing our democracy, which are obviously very different depending on who you ask.
Well, let's start right there in terms of what is plaguing democracy. How do Republicans see it, and how do Democrats see it?
Well, Republicans see it, that we've lost God, we've lost our way, and there's too much licentiousness in the society. Democrats in the poll see the obstacles that I see, and that I believe the Young Turks see, generally speaking. The Senate, the Electoral College, the filibuster, and the rest of it. The one point on which respondents from both parties agreed, which was pretty interesting to me, was that even Republicans agreed that the power of big money in politics is far too great.
Yeah, that has often been where some progressives and also people on the right seem to sort of come around and find at least some renewed hope for shared agreement, but it never really seems to go anywhere. If money were to be able to be taken out of politics, how much of that do you think would solve some of the problems that both parties see?
Well, it would go some way towards solving things, I think. But remember, money is not just campaign contributions. Money is lobbying, right? I mean, they spend more lobbying and getting Congress to do their bidding and write regulations favorable to corporations than they spend on campaigns. So you're talking about trying to get money out of politics. Ideally, you're talking about both things. I don't know if there's a legal mechanism by which you can get money out of the lobbying business. I think that ship has sailed. In campaign finance, given this Supreme Court, that ship too has sailed. But if there is a different Supreme Court someday, we can see a reversal of Citizens United and a series of decisions that democratize our process and that no longer equate money with speech, which was something the Supreme Court decided in the 1970s, which has had obviously very unfortunate ramifications for us.
The viciousness of the partisanship is really stunning. One of the poll numbers found that 43% of Democrats, 47% of Republicans see members of the other party not just as political opponents, but as political enemies who are a threat. Nearly half of each party sees the others as a threat. Yeah, and no particular difference between the two, a 4-point difference, as you say, but that's within the margin of error of this poll, which was around 1,000 people, I think. So yeah, that's a pretty stark finding. Enemies, and that number's probably only going to get bigger. How do you, how much of that number, how much of that sort of coarseness in terms of how we view people with different political views, do you trace to the sort of the world of Trump and how much our language became sort of more coarse and more harsh and insults became more acceptable?
I think I trace a lot of it to Trump, but I trace it to the right, the Gingrich right pre-Trump. I trace it to the 90s and the rise of Gingrich and the rise of Rush Limbaugh happened at the same time. Fox News Channel comes along just a few years later in 1996, just before the 1996 election was held, and the growth in recent years, the explosive growth of right-wing media, which, when you say that phrase, David, to people, right-wing media, most people think, Fox News, a couple other things, but no, it is so multi-tentacled now, as you know. Fox News and One America and Newsmax and so much local radio and so many local television operations now owned by Sinclair and other avowedly right-wing operators. It's a vast, vast network. It's probably, I bet it's bigger than the mainstream media at this point.
Yeah, and certainly with the internet and all the platforms that everybody has now that didn't exist back 26 years ago when Fox News was starting up in 1996. Given that ability that we have in our society now to essentially live in our own bubble, where we can have everything sort of affirmed for us, whatever our beliefs are, what role does that play in all of this?
Well, yeah, that plays a very big role. But I would say that the left-wing bubble is not equivalent to the right-wing bubble. I mean, if you say that the left-wing bubble includes the New York Times and National Public Radio and outlets like that, the Washington Post, which conservatives would say, well, those outlets are still giving like an honest, straightforward, objective account of the news. They have certain liberal cultural biases. And of course, their editorial pages are liberal, the Times and the Post. But they're not avowedly left in anything remotely like the way conservative properties are avowedly right.
Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of audiences in the past about having worked at Fox News and MSNBC and CNN and Al Jazeera and I-24 and now TYT. And I've said repeatedly that even TYT, I would suggest, is not as liberal, as doctrinaire as Fox News is conservative, that there's a strain of truthism, there's a strain of factual reporting that I think threads through the left far more than the right. And yet there are people on the right who don't see it that way at all. They're convinced that MSNBC is just as terrible to the left as Fox News might be to the right.
Well, they've been told this repeatedly, on a basically daily basis for years. But the difference, or one of the differences, is that MSNBC will criticize Joe Biden when he merits criticism. MSNBC criticized Barack Obama, on a number of things. I don't think Fox will ever criticize Donald Trump, ever. I mean, maybe softly a few times, but that's just not how that works. The Fox's project is much more avowedly to protect and elect Republicans.
As you put this special issue together, you made the assignments, you got the essays and the reporting back. Was there anything that surprised you about some of the things that your correspondents and reporters had found?
I think the most surprising and disturbing piece to me was an essay piece, not a reported piece, by a woman named Barbara Walter. She's an academic at University of California, San Diego, and she's a specialist on civil wars. She has been part of an American government commission that studies the rise and eruption of civil wars around the world and the conditions in countries that lead to civil wars, which she writes have been on the rise in recent decades. And she listed off the main criteria, 3 or 4 criteria for what conditions lead to civil wars. And they described the United States of America, like to a T.
Except without, the perception that many Americans have is, battles at Gettysburg, where troops line up on either side of a field and kill each other. But the reality is that civil wars tend to sort of start much more sort of slowly, that the conflict does not start in terms of a violent conflict necessarily.
Yeah, that's right. And the run up to our own Civil War started with, you could date it to a lot of different things, but you could date it to, say, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and then in increments and steps from there until Lincoln's victory in 1860 finally set off the secession movement, beginning with South Carolina. So, things take time, and I'm not saying we're definitely headed toward a shooting civil war, But I could envision, Trump raising a standing army that is separate and distinct from either A, our national army, or B, our law enforcement agencies. That is kind of Trump's army, and it's not ridiculous to think of that possibility. And then where does that take us?
Well, one of the things that in terms of the future where things take us is one of the poll numbers also found that 67% of Republicans said they would not accept a Democratic winner in 2024 based on the election results. Democrats, 88% would accept a Republican who won, only 67% of Republicans. So in other words, 1 out of every 3 Republicans is not going to accept the outcome if a Democrat wins. How do we unwind this?
Boy, that's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, they have been so persuaded by Trump and all the other people working with him over these last few couple of years that the 2020 election was stolen. I just don't now know how you put that genie back in that bottle. But we'll see what happens in 2024. But I'm really nervous about the possibility of the election being stolen and the possibility of violence.
An election being stolen, violence, and also, of course, even less faith in the U.S. democracy, an experiment that a lot of people never thought would get to this point. But in any case, it is a fascinating issue. The New Republic's May 2022 democracy issue. It's not really optimistic essays and reportings, and it won't make you feel great. But I always learn something whenever I read the New Republic. So, Michael, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
I'm really grateful for having me. Thank you, David.
Got it. Thank you.